Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. But we are switching from the world of football to the NBA, where we're talking about how a seismic trade in the Eastern Conference leads to a change in terms of fantasy implications for that team. But before we get into that segment, I do want to remind you guys yet again to, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated there. But without further ado, let's jump right into the trade that kind of shook up the Eastern Conference landscape, and that is Paul George going to the 76ers. Now, I do believe that this trade felt very much like a panic kind of moment because, as we all know, the Sixers have trusted the process that got them to the point where they were true contenders in the Eastern Conference to eventually break through and win an NBA championship, but they just have struggled to find any level of consistency or the right players and the right fits to surround a guy like Joel Embiid to really break through an Eastern Conference that just got very crowded around them all of a sudden. And so this felt like a swing for the fences, going for broke kind of trade where they acquire a player in Paul George who, is a very experienced player, can help this team. There are some questions I have in terms of whether or not Paul George remains an efficient enough player, especially in the postseason, to really carry this team to the next level. But looking at this trade from a neutral perspective, I truly believe that the Sixers are going to become one of the more feared teams in the Eastern Conference because of it. Now, let's look into how this trade really shook up the odds, actually, of the Eastern Conference. Their championship odds, that is, of course, the NBA championship, not the Eastern Conference ones, were cut from 12 to 1 to 10 to 1. And then, of course, the Eastern Conference odds, 7 to 1 to 5 to 1, actually moving ahead of the Knicks after they themselves made a trade for Mikal Bridges. And that's just the way the kind of open market can change any given landscape in both conferences at any given moment. And I truly feel like another big reason why they were able to make this trade, the Sixers, is because a majority of their contracts expire and they're players who they really don't necessarily need at this moment in time. I think that this was a very value-heavy trade for Paul George, where they're beginning to value players that can really help sustain a core that isn't so Embiid-centric, because as we see, the wear and tear that Joel Embiid faces in this league is truly something that's damaging to his career, not just as a player, but as someone who wants to win a championship. And so, getting a guy to add that balance truly is effective. Now, looking at the 76ers roster, it's now a very lengthy, versatile, more distribution-based, pass-heavy offense, in my humble opinion. I think that looking at the point guard position with Tyrese Maxey, I think he's very electric, very good ball handling skills, but I kind of feel like him being viewed as the second star of that team really put a lot of pressure on his back, and the weight of expectations, especially in the city of Philadelphia, kind of gets to him at certain points where he wants to rush things a little bit, and he doesn't fall back on the players that he already has around him. And so I think the addition of Paul George will help him learn certain aspects of the game where he can take a back seat and not have to worry about forcing things, because at certain times offensive stagnate. We see it with great offenses. Sometimes they just stagnate. And so Tyrese Maxey now has someone who can kind of take the load away from him and have him focus on developing his skills to get to a point where he's just a reliable point guard. I don't think he needs to be a star point guard. I think that being reliable is just enough for what the 76ers want of him. Then we look at a guy in Tobias Harris who's now becoming more of a role player for the Sixers squad, and someone who, as a starter, certainly can be frustrating in terms of his shot creation. In some ways, kind of becoming a little bit selfish, where he's trying to create shots out of what Embiid does in the paint, and ultimately kind of restricting the ways that the 76ers can develop their style of play. And so, by adding Paul George, you now add someone who's just a better version of what Tobias Harris can bring to the table right now. He's still a better passer, he's a better finisher, he takes more field goals, but they're more effective because of the way that he can elevate others through his skill in different areas, and you don't necessarily have to worry about Paul George taking field goals. With that being said, this team now becomes one of the more intriguing fantasy teams in the NBA, as these kind of trios certainly do when people swing for the fences and get a player to complete the trio. Now, the big question mark will always be Embiid. What can Embiid do in terms of his fantasy production? Because he's always been a number one type player, a guy who will always go at the top of the drafts, especially in a heavy center-centric market. Now that big men have kind of re-revolutionized this position, Joel Embiid will still be highly coveted, and I think that if anyone gets positively affected by this trade, it is going to be Joel Embiid, because Paul George will understand that, hey, even though I'm part of this trio, I'm not the biggest part right now, and he will be sure to distribute the rock to Joel Embiid. Now, in terms of other players on the squad, Tyrese Maxey, I think that this will also positively affect him, but maybe not as soon as it will with a guy like Embiid, because I think Paul George stepping in and assuming the mantle as probably the second best player on this team will make sure that Tyrese Maxey, while taking a back seat, learns and develops himself at the point guard position to understand that at some times he might be needed more than others. I think that right now he's trying too hard to be a star and not focusing on the facets of a game that make him truly special. And so, with the acquisition of Paul George, Tyrese Maxey will, at the beginning of this whole experiment, kind of get off to a rocky start. But as this experiment goes on, as it progresses, Tyrese Maxey is definitely going to become someone who is going to truly understand the point guard position at a fuller level. He's going to view the game. He's not going to put up many numbers in terms of fantasy production, I don't think. He is definitely going to suffer in terms of that regard. But in terms of playing the game of basketball, I think that's where Tyrese Maxey will truly improve, because he's going to take a much more relaxed approach to now understanding what it means to be part of a trio and not a duo in terms of this Philadelphia 76ers team. And then, Tobias Harris, I think he's still a valuable asset. I don't think he's as bad as people think he's getting to be, and he's never truly been the worst role player by any stretch of the imagination that the Philadelphia Sixers have at their disposal. And, he might frustrate at certain times, when all four of these players are on the court. But you get your lumps with a guy like Tobias Harris. He is someone who can impact games positively, and there are some moments where you're scratching your head at what exactly he's doing. And with every role player position, you are looking for someone who just sets the bar. That's all they need to do. And so far, Tobias Harris has proven that he can set that bar. And I know it sounds cliche, but now that he's certainly not going to have as many minutes in the system, I do believe that him still being there does create the sense of depth and experience as well. So, ultimately, I'm not necessarily certain Tobias Harris will be as comfortable as he was in the construction of the Sixers offense as he was in the past, now that they have that third star. But I still believe there's merit to what he does. In terms of fantasy, I still think he's a valuable bench asset to have. But overall, looking at this team as a whole, the fact that they failed the process up to this point, and now they have Paul George at their disposal, proves to me that the 76ers are in a weird kind of panic mode. They're not necessarily, resting on their laurels and saying, oh, woe is me. They are swinging for the fences. But it certainly feels like a weird source of desperation to go out for a player like Paul George when you have certainly the experience that you need in this squad. And right now, while Paul George certainly is someone that definitely elevates this team, and we see it in what the odds say, it's going to be very, very pivotal in how the 76ers adapt to him and what he does. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we go back to the world of football with me reviewing my Euros fantasy stars from these quarterfinal games, who truly impressed me over the weekend and deserves to be considered for your final ever Euro 2024 fantasy squad. We'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with that segment.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?